This lecture will be a brief introduction to neural networks. Neural networks are not a major part of this course, but it would not be reasonable to have a machine learning course without at least mentioning a bit neural networks. And I'm going to focus on the basic architecture of the multi-layer perceptron. So basically a neural network with several layers that are fully connected in the forward direction. So each layer connected to the next one. I'm going to talk a bit about the perception, the limitations of the linear discrimination in one single neuron, and then how a multi-layer perceptron can solve that nonlinear discrimination problem by doing those nonlinear transformations to the data that we saw previously with logistic regression. I'm going to explain backpropagation and how to train a multi-layer perceptron, and also talk a bit about regularization in this context. So the idea of the perceptron is inspired on the neuron, and that's why we call them artificial neural networks. The neuron is a large cell that has these dendrites that receive inputs, that sense some stimulus, and if the stimulus passes some threshold, so if it falls below that threshold, the neuron doesn't do anything. But if the stimulus passes this threshold, then the depolarization of the membrane propagates through the axon and will result in the release of neurotransmitters in the synaptic terminals there. So basically we can see that the neuron is integrating stimulus from lots of different inputs, and if the overall result passes some threshold, it will fire an impulse, and it's sort of like an all or nothing system. We can model this mathematically by using the input. So this would be the equivalent of the dendrites that we have the inputs here. We can calibrate how sensitive each input branch is with these weights that we can change. So each input value is multiplied by some weight, and then we have the weighted sum of all the inputs here. So this is more or less what's happening here on the dendrites, that each is providing some sensory data to the neuron body there. Then we sum everything up, all the weighted sum here, and we pass this through some activation function that works like this threshold limit here. So it provides an impulse if the input is strong enough or not. So this was the first idea of the perceptron. The activation function was simply this threshold. So we added all the inputs multiplied by the weights and added some offset value here. And if the result was larger than 0, then the output was 1. If the result was smaller or equal to 0, the output was 0. So basically this part here would model the response of the body of the neuron and the dendrites. And then if this passed the threshold, so if the expression was larger than 0, the neuron would fire. This was the original perceptron, and the rule for training the perceptron was quite simple. So for each example, we would compare the target value of that we wanted. So each example could have a class of 1 or 0, and this would be the target value for the example. And we would compare that with the output of our perceptron. And we would multiply that by a small fraction, for example, 0.1, 0.2, something like that, so that we wouldn't give large jumps. And multiplying this term by each of the inputs would give us the adjustment to the weight corresponding to that input. So basically this rule would tell us to adjust the weights every time the output was wrong and in the direction necessary to make it closer to right. So if we are providing 1 when the output should be 0, then we need to reduce a bit the weight if the input is positive, or increase if it is negative, and so on. So basically this is the update rule. Every time the perceptron makes a mistake, we adjust the weights a bit in order to reduce the amount of mistakes. And this worked quite well. They could train the perceptron to classify things, but the problem was that it's just a linear classifier, as we can see. And if we want to combine these together, then we don't, in multiple layers, it's not practical to have this kind of function, because we need a continuous derivative to propagate the adjustments from one layer to the next. And so one classical approach, nowadays we use different activation functions, but just to explain this more historical context and the basic idea, this sigmoid function was used the same as we use in logistic regression, because it's similar to that threshold function, but the derivative is continuous, and so it's a lot better behaved when we want to propagate the error and train with several layers. So strictly speaking, the perceptron is the original single neuron or single the original basic model with just one neuron by Frank Rosenblatt, with this threshold activation here. But currently, perceptron, multi-layer perceptron, is used for basically a neural network that is fully connected and forward fed, so each layer feeding into the next one. We will not worry too much about the actual name. The important thing here is to understand how these things work. So let's look at what one neuron can do. One neuron can learn to classify linearly separable sets, because if you see this kind of thing that we have here, if we have the weighted sum of the inputs plus and then fed into a logistic activation function, this is actually the same model as the logistic regression. We are training it in a way that's a bit different, but it's exactly the same thing. Adding the product of the weights to the input and then passing it into the logistic function. So this is a linear classifier, like logistic regression. And we can separate examples like this. This is a representation of the OR function. So 1, 0 is 1, 1, 1 is 1, 0, 1 is 1, but 0, 0 is 0. So there are two classes like this here. We can do this by minimizing the quadratic error between the desired output. The desired output is either 1 or 0, and the output of our neuron. And we present each example and we adjust the weights in order to minimize this quadratic error. So how can we do this? Basically, we can find out for each position that we are in the parameters. So this would be the weights for our neuron. We have here the surface of the error function, and we must figure out for each position that we are in which direction we would be going down on this surface. So we would be minimizing the error if we go into that direction. And this we can know by the derivatives of the function. So basically we have we need to find out how to adjust each individual weight back here by in a way that minimizes the error between the activation and the target value. So this is the quadratic error, this is the sigmoid function, this is a weighted sum, and all the way going back to the weights. So if we just chain these derivatives, we can do this. We can go down the derivative of the error function with respect to the weight, which we can compute by multiplying the derivative of the error function with respect to the output of our neuron, the derivative of the output of the neuron with respect to the input into the sigmoid function, and then the derivative of that weighted sum that we input into the sigmoid function with respect to the weight. And all these derivatives we can compute. So for the quadratic error, the derivative of the error with respect to the output of the neuron is this one, so minus the target minus the output. The derivative of the output of the neuron with respect to what goes into the sigmoid function is the derivative of the sigmoid function, so it's this one here. And then the derivative of the weighted sum with respect to the weight is simply the value of the input, because that's what we're multiplying by the weight. So we can chain all of this and we have this expression. So this would be the expression that tells us how we must change the weight, in which direction we must change the weight in order to slide down this error surface. So we can do a small step there. This constant parameter here is the learning rate. So it's generally about 0.1, 0.5, something like that, because, or it can be even much smaller if we have a large network, but for these kind of examples, these values can work. Because we want to take small steps and not to lose the minimum there, or start diverging in this process. So intuitively, we are taking the derivative of the error function when comparing the output to the target value, then the derivative of the sigmoid output function, and then the derivative of the weighted sum, and multiplying all these derivatives, we can figure out how to change the weight in order to reduce the error between the output and the target value. And as we give different examples in random order, we start sliding down this surface. So this would be online training. We give one example, we update the weights, we give another example, we update the weights, and so on, and we find how to go down this surface until we find the point, the combination of weights that minimize the error. Another way of doing this is to use batch training. We give several examples, so we are at this point, we give several examples and we add all their contributions, and then update the weights in one batch and take a larger jump. So usually this is what is done for training deep neural networks, because it's more efficient, especially with parallel computing, with GPU and so on. So let's see what happens when we train our neuron to try to classify this example. So we have two weights here. We have the error function, which is the result of the sigmoid. We need to approach 1 on this side and approach 0 on that side. And then it finds this discriminant here at the threshold of 0.5. And it does this fairly consistently. So this is the plot of the training error as we run several simulations. These are the number of epochs, and one epoch in training neural networks is one pass through all the examples. So in this case, we only have 4 examples. We present them at random in each network, in each epoch, in a random order, but always the 4 examples in each epoch. So after presenting these a few thousand times, the neuron learns how to classify this. However, if we try to classify this set, so this would be a representation of the exclusive OR function. It's 1 if there is a 1, 0 or a 0, 1, but it's 0 if it's 0, 0 or 1, 1. And this is not linearly separable. There is no way we can find a straight line that separates these two correctly. So if we try to train the single neuron to solve this problem, we cannot leave this part. So you see, this is a quadratic error, a mean quadratic error of 0.25. If you take the square root of that, this is the 0.5, which means it's making mistakes half of the time. That's the best it can do, because it cannot separate these correctly. It either puts one point in the wrong position there and is very close to the line, or it does even worse in some other directions and so forth. So there's no way a linear classifier can solve this problem. But we can solve this problem with a multi-layer perceptron. So let's build a network like this. This is one neuron that receives the 2 inputs. So the 2 inputs are the 2 axes here, and has these 2 weights, for two weights, 1 for each input. We also create this additional input of 1 here, which is similar to that one that we added in logistic regression when we are bringing the threshold value into the vector for the dot product. So basically, this one, since it's constant, allows us to use this additional weight just to determine if our sigmoid function will answer to the left or to the right a bit more. So we can use this to shift the function sideways. And we do this with 3 neurons. We have 1 neuron here, 1 neuron there. These are called the neurons of the hidden layer, because we are not seeing directly the output of these neurons. Each one outputs into the output neuron. So this is the output layer, the inputs are here, and this is the hidden layer. All of these have an additional one there to work as the threshold. So each neuron here has 3 different parameters that it can adjust in order to to modify the way it answers to the inputs. The hidden layer is receiving the inputs directly from our data. The output neuron is receiving as input the output of the hidden layer. Okay, so now to train this, we can train the output neuron, that is to compute all these parameters for the output neuron. We can follow exactly the same rule. We have the derivative of the quadratic error between the output and the target value, and then the derivative of the sigmoid and the derivative of the sum, and we have the same expression. Things get a bit more complicated when we reach these inner neurons, because we actually have to intuitively we can have several output neurons, and to update this weight we need to consider the error of this output neuron with respect to the target value here, and then the sigmoid function, that is the activation function here, the weighted sum there, the sigmoid function here, the weighted sum here, all the way until we get to this parameter. And the same thing for any other branch if we have more output neurons. So this is the expression that we follow here. For the output neuron, we have the same multiplication of derivatives, but then as we go back into the network, we have to sum the contribution of all the neurons that are ahead of each neuron we're considering. So if we are considering this one here, we have to sum the contribution of all the neurons in the other layers that are in front of this one, and then we have to keep tracing back through the sigmoid function and the weighted sum. So this is the backpropagation part of the backpropagation algorithm, is to propagate the error backwards through all these derivatives, and we can compute these update values for each neuron. So by tracing back the error from the end until each weight. For the output neurons, we only have to go this far until we reach these weights. But for neurons that are further inside our network, we have to keep multiplying these derivatives and going backwards. So the backpropagation algorithm starts by propagating forward the inputs through all the layers. So we input here, we propagate the activation, compute the activation of this neuron, we input the activation of these neurons into the next ones, and so on. So if we have several layers, we can do this several times. And then for the output neurons, we'll compute this delta factor, so the updates for all the weights in the output neurons. We use like this, and then we backpropagate these errors through the previous neuron. So we keep propagating all the contributions of all the derivatives all the way back through the network. And this is the backpropagation algorithm, and then we can update the weights after we calculate all these deltas. So each weight will be updated by multiplying the delta, the corresponding delta for that neuron, with the learning rate, that small fraction that we're using, and the input that is passing through this weight. Note that for the first layer, the input is actually the input of our data, but for subsequent layers, the input is actually the output of the previous layer, because each layer will feed into the next one. Okay, so this is a very brief description of the backpropagation algorithm, but with this algorithm we can in theory train layers with arbitrary number of, or networks with an arbitrary number of layers. And we can solve this problem, the exclusive OR problem, using this network with 3 neurons. So in this case, the output will be like this, where it answers 0 for these ones and 1 for the other 2 outside. And it manages to go down to reduce the error. Note that this takes a bit longer to train, so you have a lot more epochs here, and so in some cases it takes longer than others, but eventually it learns to classify this correctly. And what's happening here is that the first layer here, the hidden layer, is transforming the data in a way that the last neuron can now use as a linear classifier. So if we look at the activation of the hidden layer, we can see what's happening here. So this is the activation of one of the neurons in the hidden layer, and this is the other one. You can see that during training it will start separating the points in a way that is unable for each neuron alone to classify. So if we consider this neuron, it puts this red one here, the blue ones here, and the other red one below. So there is no way it can separate red from blue. And the same thing happens with the second neuron. It puts this red one here, the blue ones here, and then the other red one here. So neither of these two inner neurons alone can classify this data set correctly. But when the last neuron looks at the input it's getting from the other two, it's looking at something that looks like this. The data has been transformed in the hidden layer. And now it can simply create a discriminant in this part, and it can split the two. When we project backwards through all this transformation to the beginning, this is the result that we see. So you see that thing we did with the non-linear projection of the data with logistic regression in order to overcome the limitation of being a linear classifier, the neural network can do automatically in the hidden layers by transforming the data non-linear, because it has that non-linear activation, and this allows the layers in front to deal with transformed data, and so eventually they're able to solve these problems of non-linear classification. Okay, so there are many different ways of using neural networks. This is just another example. The auto-associator or autoencoder as it's called today. We train a neural network to give as output the same as the input. So this apparently has no particular use, but in this case we have 8 inputs, and we put either a value of 1 in one of them and 0 in the rest. So it's 1, 0, 0, 0, or 0, 1, and the rest 0, and so forth. So we have 8 different possible values in the input. And we require the network to output the same thing as the input. And we are training that with backpropagation many times. We're passing these examples thousands of times. But the network inside, in the hidden layer, only has 3 neurons. So what happens here is that these 3 neurons learn a sort of binary code for the 8 different inputs, because that is the only way to represent the 8 different inputs. This is not in order, but this is an actual example of training this network until the error goes down. And when we see what happens in the hidden layer, we see that for this input it has these values, for this input these values, and so on, and you have all the 8 combinations of 3 bits here in this encoding. So this is called an autoencoder because you can create an encoding of your data just by passing your data through these networks. So there are many different architectures, many different uses for neural networks. Just to give a brief idea of what we do in practice, we start with small random values close to 0, because these functions tend to saturate rapidly away from 0. And even if you don't use these functions, there are problems with numerical stability for backpropagation and so on. Then since we initialize the weights at random and we provide examples in random orders, it must be noted that the trajectory is not always the same. So each time you run, you may have slightly different trajectories until you reach the desired result. We should standardize or normalize the inputs. You need to use the same scale for all the inputs, because you're using one learning rate for all dimensions. You shouldn't have the inputs of very different scales, and also you should avoid saturating the functions and creating numerical problems by having very large values. And then we do this stochastic gradient descent, so we present the examples in random order and we descend the gradient by looking at those derivatives for all these examples or for the batches. We can evaluate the error, for example, for training, for cross-validation, and so on. We can optimize some parameters or architectures, do the same things that we do with different classifiers. The thing is that training has this particular schedule of going through the examples many times in random orders in order to find the optimal combination of parameters. And if we look during the training, which is something that we generally don't do in other kinds of classifiers, we can actually look at the cross-validation error while we are training the network. So we are training for a different number of epochs, and then we look at the error outside the training set, for example, for validation or using cross-validation or something like that. And we can find, for example, that if we train too much, then even though the training error, which is in red here, keeps going down, the validation error starts going up. So actually we can see that at some point the network starts overfitting. So one simple way of doing regularization in neural networks, which is the idea that we can change the training method to minimize overfitting, is to actually stop training early. We don't let the network train too much. We stop here maybe at 30, 20, 40 epochs, something like that, to prevent the validation error from going up. Other methods of regularization are, for example, reducing the weights or decreasing the weight values by a small fraction at each iteration. So parameters that are not very useful for classifying the data tend to shrink down to zero. This is actually L2 regularization, the same that we saw in logistic regression, which can be implemented like this in neural networks. So to sum up, this is just a very brief introduction to neural networks. We're not going to actually work with neural networks in this course because this is a very active and very broad and deep field of research nowadays for deep learning, and we need specific tools and a lot more time to start working on this. So there will be specific courses on deep learning for the next semester, both for the masters in big data and in computer science. They have different focuses, but you can learn more about this if you want in other courses. In this course, we're not going to cover more of neural networks, just this basic few notions. So we saw the classical idea of the perceptron and how we can join these neurons together in simple networks using backpropagation and stochastic gradient descent to find the best combination of parameters. And we saw how with several layers or with more than one layer, we can now go beyond the linear classification capability of a single neuron, because each layer can transform the data in a nonlinear manner and feed into the next layer. And this is actually a very useful extension of this idea that we saw in logistic regression, because the example that we saw, we were manually doing the transformations in order to try to find the best model. But with a neural network, most of the network work is actually learning the best transformations so that the last layer can give the correct result. And so we are putting all this work of trying to find the best transformations into the learning system instead of we having to do it ourselves. So I recommend that you read these chapters. Mitchell's book is rather old, but it has a very good explanation of backpropagation. So you can take a look at that. It has the actual pseudocode. It's easy to understand. Alpiden, if you read this chapter, you must take note that this one is assuming that the output of the network is linear. So if you have a network for classification, typically the output will be the sigmoid function, for the same reasons we use that in logistic regression. But if you are using a neural network for regression, sometimes we can also do that, then the output should be linear and not have an activation function, so that you can approximate any value that you want. And if you have a linear output, then all those derivatives that you see in backpropagation will have slightly different formula. So take note that the examples Alpiden gives have a linear output. Okay, so that's it for today. Today I talked quite a lot. I will set up the Zoom meeting and I'll meet you there for a bit if you have any questions. So see you soon.